That is Ashley Turner, the victim's sister, and we are hearing emotional testimony from her about her sister. This is the death penalty phase of the trial. The defendant, Mr. Love, was already found guilty of capital murder, and we are listening to testimony that is aggravating and mitigating in the sentencing phase. We're going to throw to a quick break, but we'll be back live in the courtroom on the other end. Stick with us. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz. We have a live feed in the courtroom in the sentencing phase of the Love trial. With me, criminal defense attorney Jennifer. I want to talk to you a second about this case before we go to a quick break and go back into the courtroom. Jennifer, it's great to see you on the screen here. We just heard some really moving testimony from the sister of the victim and friend of the victim. Why is it necessary for the jury to hear this during the sentencing phase of what is a death penalty case?
Sure. Hi, Carissa.
Hey.
Perhaps this testimony from the victim's family and friends is really the most critical evidence for the jury to hear. I mean, we're humanizing, we're hearing about the real person who Kendra Hatcher was, as a friend, as a sister, as a family member, as a professional. So we're hearing about just her life, why it was valued by so many people and how deeply affected so many people are as a result of her murder.
Right. And, you know, I think that both of those who we just heard testify did a very good job of showing how normal she was and how she wasn't involved in any drugs or crime, and are really laying the groundwork to show that none of us are safe. So really, really unnerving testimony for anyone to hear, because it really does set the tone of what's going on out there. We need to take a quick break, but we will be back in the courtroom in just a few minutes, so stick with us and don't go anywhere. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz, and we are covering gavel to gavel, the sentencing phase of the Love case. He's facing the death penalty. With me, criminal defense attorneys Jennifer Schuster and Matthew Mangino. Nice to have you both with us. I want to discuss with you, we are listening to testimony that's emotional in the death penalty phase from the victim's sister, and we also, before our last break, listened to testimony from her friend. Both are crying. Now, we already went through the trial. We already know he's guilty of capital murder. Is it necessary to be playing this testimony, or is it overkill in the eyes of the judge, the jury, or anyone else watching? Let's start with you, Matthew.
Well, it's very necessary, because what they have to do in this case is humanize the victim. I mean, we've heard testimony about the defendant, we've heard testimony about the crime in this case, but now we're humanizing the victim. And this testimony has been very compelling, because we hear what a beautiful person the victim was in this case. And, you know, and I think that the jury has to understand that this is not only a loss of a significant life, you know, a dentist, someone who was very much involved in her community, but also has had an impact on her family and her friends and the extended community. So this testimony is extremely important in terms of the penalty phase of this trial.
So before I go to you, Jennifer, I want to do more of a follow-up question and ask you to take it one step further. We all know that he's not the only guilty one in this case. That's her picture. She's a beautiful girl. It's such a sad story that you're seeing. But we all know that, you know, this is a death penalty case, and Love was not the only person involved. What about the fact that he's the only one facing the death penalty and not the other parties that are co-defendants?
Well, I think in this case, you know, we're focusing on this single defendant. Certainly, we heard testimony about his accomplice, and we know that she's pled guilty and she's not facing the death penalty. But, you know, this case is about Kristopher Love.
And same with the other defendant who needs to be extradited.
Right.
also not facing the death penalty. So
Right.
do you think we're going to hear from the defense saying, wait a minute, it's not fair that only this defendant is facing the death penalty? Is that even a fair argument?
Well, it may be an argument, but I don't think it's a fair argument. We're talking about the trigger man here. This was the person who put the gun, to the victim's head and pulled the trigger. This is a cold, calculated, heinous crime. It's one of the aggravating circumstances that exists under Texas law. So, yeah, you could make that argument, but I don't think it's going to carry a lot of weight.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add to this?
I have to say that I don't think that you can go wrong with hearing from these victims. Maybe they're a little bit duplicative, and probably one of them alone could have gotten the job done in terms of showing the jury about how gravely impacted all of these people's lives were as a result of this murder. I don't think it's particularly relevant or fair for the defense to argue that the other co-defendants will not be put to death. It doesn't matter. It's an entirely separate trial. And it can cut both ways. The jury could say, well, I think somebody should pay, so it doesn't even matter to me. Or the fact that those two other co-defendants can't be put to death is all the more reason that this defendant should pay by being executed.
All right, sounds like great analysis. We're going to take a quick break, but stick with us. We'll be back in just a minute for some more on this case. Welcome back. Okay, you are listening there to James Grigsby, a former Memphis police officer, and he is talking about the defendant's previous incidents in the death penalty phase of this trial. This is part of the sentencing, and I want to get some real insight and legal analysis on this. With me, Jennifer and Matt, still with me on this. Jennifer, what are they getting at by having the officers bring up prior incidents like this?
Sure. So one of the questions the jury has to answer is this defendant a continuing threat to society? So it's critical to hear evidence of the defendant's criminal history. And that officer we're hearing from now is able to testify to just that.
And Matthew, what about the fact that things are coming in that the defense may say that wasn't fair and this could be appealed? Is there a risk for that?
Well, there could be a risk, but this is the penalty phase of the case, and so the rules of evidence are much more relaxed in terms of what can come in before the jury. Typically we wouldn't hear this information about a prior criminal act. We didn't hear that during the trial of this case, and some evidence that we've heard from the victim's sister and the victim's friend, we typically wouldn't hear that in a trial. But in the penalty phase, this is all relevant evidence because the jury has to decide, an extremely important matter, and that's the matter of life or death. And so they need to have as much information before them as they can to make this decision. And therefore, the court permits this type of information that otherwise wouldn't be admissible in the guilt phase to come to this jury.
Okay, all good points. And guess what? We have more information about Love's prior incidences. Now we're going to hear from Brad Hill. He's a special agent with the Memphis Drug Task Force. Let's go to this testimony, and then let's see if you still hold the same opinion of whether or not this is necessary, more probative or prejudicial, and could be potential grounds for an appeal, or probative and totally allowable to be allowed in for this case. Let's take a look at what he has to say. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz, and that was Brad Hill, a special agent, talking about Love's previous incidences, such as drugs, such as the circuit he's running. Matthew, I know I asked you a question before he spoke. What do you think now after listening to what he's bringing into evidence? Probative or prejudicial?
Well, I think it's probative. I don't have any concern about it. I think that this is important evidence that needs to be presented to the jury in the penalty phase of a capital case. I don't see anything here that would be unduly prejudicial to the defendant during the course of this penalty phase.
Jennifer, do you agree, or do you think it's overkill and that one of these witnesses enough could have been enough? I mean, what's your position on this?
I think this evidence in particular is probative, but I do think there is the potential risk of the prosecution overdoing it here, because we don't necessarily have to hear about every single itty-bitty crime that he ever committed. To that end, I think it could be detrimental. And I don't know if in this instance the defendant was actually convicted of this crime. And I think that could be a basis for an appeal if these crimes weren't in fact ever adjudicated. Okay. Yes, the rules of evidence are relaxed.
Great point. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stick with us, and we'll come back for more in-studio analysis and more on this trial. Welcome back. Before we go to what we're covering here on the network, which is the death penalty phase of the Love trial, the sentencing phase, I want to talk with my guests about that last story we just saw. Jennifer and Matthew, the missing girl. There she is, heart-wrenching picture, beautiful girl. Is there anything else that you feel we should be doing to help find her? Right now, it seems like everyone is holding on to hope. The reward has hit $50,000. What else can we do and encourage the public to do to assist this missing persons investigation?
Well, I think the bottom line is in any case like this, you know, if you've seen something, if you heard something, you got to talk to the authorities about it. You know, I'm sure that the police are doing a lot of work that we don't know about, you know, trying to collect as much intelligence as they can to try to put some pieces together and maybe, you know, shed some light on what may have happened to this young girl. But I think the bottom line in terms of the public is if you think you know something, if there's something that you were suspicious of, that there's something that you heard or saw, you have to go to the authorities and you have to tell them about it.
Okay. And Jennifer, anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, Carissa, it's so critical, like Matthew said, for people to say something if they see something. But the way to really get the word out there is for people to mobilize. And what can folks at home do? Viewers such as those with this program, they can post on social media, Instagram, and Facebook.
I think that's the key thing, what you just said, posting on social media. I think people underestimate the power of social media. And if everyone posts on their own social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever accounts, and that is shared, that can go viral, and you never know who may have seen something that could lead to a tip because they saw that post. Okay. Let's switch gears, like we do here on the network all the time. We're going to go back to the sentencing phase of the Kristopher Love case. This is a death penalty trial. He was found guilty of capital murder, and now we are in the sentencing phase. Right now on the stand is Brad Hill. He is a special agent of the Memphis Drug Task Force, and he is discussing prior incidents of Kristopher Love, which is aggravating factors, and the prosecution believes probative, not prejudicial, but probative into finding that the defendant should be found and held accountable for a death penalty sentence. Let's take a look. Welcome back. That is Brad Hill. He's a special agent with the Memphis Drug Task Force, and he is talking about incidents that lend some insight into the character of the defendant as he faces the death penalty. This is the sentencing phase. Matthew and Jennifer. Matthew first. What are they trying to show here in court? And then Jennifer, I want to ask you as a follow-up, what do you think the effect is on the jury? Let's start with Matthew first. What are they trying to show in court here?
Well, I think they're being very methodical about showing that this isn't Kristopher Love's first contact with the criminal justice system. And in a way, you know, he has been involved in criminal activity. His involvement in criminal activity to a certain extent is sophisticated. So they want to paint a picture that this isn't, you know, just a guy, you know, who had a couple of minor run-ins with the law. This was a guy who was involved in, you know, somewhat sophisticated drug transactions. And, you know, that kind of paints a picture of what kind of person Kristopher Love really is. Okay,
that's a really good point. Jennifer, what do you think the effect is on the jury? And then piggyback on what you said earlier, is it overkill or is this necessary?
Well, like Matthew said, I think the jury is going to think this isn't this guy's first rodeo. So to that end, we know he's engaged in a long criminal history. and that helps them answer the question, is he a continuing threat to society? And that's one of the critical questions in this phase. But I think the prosecution is sort of throwing the kitchen sink at this, and to that end, their case can seem a bit unfocused and perhaps confuse the jury if they're hearing too much as it relates to these other crimes that maybe are perhaps not as serious or maybe weren't even ever adjudicated.
Right. So those are all good points. It could go either way. On one hand, it could be confusing the jury, and maybe it was just enough with the current trial and the guilty verdict that this jury is already sold. This guy is guilty, and it's the same jury that found him guilty deciding whether or not he's going to be sentenced to death in this penalty phase. We have more testimony from Brad Hill, the special agent. So let's go to that and then come back on the other end. Okay, a little bit of a key point here, and he has an active warrant. Jennifer, I want you to speak to this. This isn't a guilty conviction. It's an active warrant that they're now bringing up. What are your thoughts about that? What are they getting at?
Well, it would depend on the rules of evidence in Texas. I think, as we've been discussing, the prosecution is sort of pushing the envelope here by bringing up things that could potentially be an issue for appeal when maybe they don't have to do that. So I'm not exactly sure what the prosecution's strategy here is, other than just trying to throw every possible issue out there so the jurors can think this is a really bad guy.
Right. Okay. And Matthew, I know you said before that you didn't really think that anything would be worrisome for appeal, but after hearing that is bringing up information about active warrants, not convictions, do you still hold the same position, or do you think that the prosecution could be, juggling an appeal here that could come down, and maybe this isn't necessary to do because they already have someone guilty of capital murder?
Right, Chris, I don't change my position at all, because don't forget, this is
always
the penalty.
Great to have a debate.
Yeah, but this is sentencing. I mean, and it's not uncommon. Sentence guidelines include prior records. We often look at charges in terms of sentencing purposes, not necessarily just convictions. We know here that this is a warrant, so we know there's another charge. It's also indicative of fleeing, not with regard to this particular offense, but it just shows a history of disregard for the criminal justice system, disregard for society, and I think it goes straight to that point of dangerousness or the propensity for future violence. And so I don't think that this is in any way subject to review in any meaningful way by an appellate court in Texas.
Right. And I think that that's a key point to bring up for the viewers. It is a relaxed rule of evidence in the sentencing phase, and arrest records are admissible. Hearsay is admissible. The jury gets to hear these things come in that may not otherwise have been allowed in at a trial, which has a higher standard of rules of evidence being applied. We have to take a quick break. Stick with us, and we'll be back on the other end. Heart-wrenching testimony to listen to. I mean, we're listening to the mom, we're listening to the boyfriend. Everybody is well-groomed and prim and proper, and you just don't expect this to happen when someone is a professional running a very normal life, not involved in drugs or even associating with that group of people. Matthew and Jennifer, I want to take this opportunity to dissect what we just heard in this death penalty phase and sentencing phase of this trial. What do you think the jury is making of the testimony we're hearing from the mother and the boyfriend? Both emotional, both heart-wrenching, and both just really make us all feel unsafe. Wouldn't you say, Jennifer?
Yeah, you're right, Carissa. It's absolutely gut-wrenching, especially hearing from the mom. I mean, those tears, that pain, that anguish, it's so real, and I'm certain that it's resonating with the jurors. We've been talking about, is it too much to have all of these witnesses back to back? I don't think so. This is incredibly compelling testimony, and we really get a sense from these folks about how adversely their lives were affected as a result of this crime.
Right. They're all victims. I mean, this whole family is a victim, and everyone who thinks they're safe and normal as a society. We are all victims to these kinds of crimes, which happen, unfortunately, all the time. These murder-for-hire plots and schemes happen. Matthew, how do you think the jury's taking these multiple rounds of testimony of emotional pleas of the victims' friends, families, and boyfriends? And then when you're done answering that question, we're going to go to the victim's friend, who also has more of a tearful testimony to give to us as an audience and to the jury. What do you make of it so far?
Well, this is victim impact testimony. That's what it is.
But is it overkill?
Yeah, not at all. I think that it humanizes, as I said earlier, the victim. When we talk about a case like this, we often speak of the victim. Kendra's the victim. There are far more victims in this case than Kendra. I mean, we've heard from her mother now. We've heard from her boyfriend. We've heard from her sister. We've heard from her friends. These people have all been impacted significantly. We've heard how this has been life-altering for them. And so the jury needs to know that. The jury needs to know just how much this heinous act by Kristopher Love has impacted so many people in the community. And it's important that the jury understand that and hear it firsthand from the victims.
Okay, and we have more testimony about how the community was affected. Right now on the stand, we have Tammy Pantano, the victim's friend, and she's also very emotional and shell-shocked over the loss of her friends. Let's take a look. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz, and that was surveillance footage. Remember, we are in the Love death penalty sentencing phase of this trial. With me, Matthew and Jennifer. What are the key takeaway points that you took from that video that's being replayed for the jury and also in evidence? Matthew, you go first.
Well, I think that what the prosecution is doing here is saying that, any statement that, Kristopher Love would have made, that there was a struggle for the purse, is dispelled by this piece of video, and they did it very well, very methodically, step by step, in slow motion. They made sure that they emphasized, where Kendra's vehicle was when Kristopher came into the picture, and the fact that they sped off, and it really shows that his explanation for what had occurred here is not plausible.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add, any more insight legally, strategically, on why we're looking at that video and how they're pinpointing with the red arrows on the screen, showing us what we're looking at? Anything to add there?
Strategically, they're just reminding the jury what this is all about, that this man engaged in this crime. He didn't just pull the trigger. He actively planned it with these other defendants. And we see him just driving away unscathed, when we know this woman was left murdered, and that's compelling for the jury in this sentencing phase.
Absolutely aggravating factors for sure to consider. We have more video to look at and show you. We have body cam footage of Sergeant Michael Welch. Let's take a look at that and then have some time to dissect it. Talk about really taking you to the scene of a crime. That body cam footage took us there, and while she is blurred out, you could see her cell phone on the floor. You could see the blood on the floor of the parking car garage, or the garage where her car was parked, and really does lend legitimacy and reality to what happened beyond courtroom testimony. Jennifer, do you have any insight on how you think the jury is taking this?
Well, like you said, Carissa, it doesn't get any more real than this. I mean, we're literally being taken to the scene of the crime. We're seeing the body there, just the horrific nature of this crime, and certainly is having an impact on the jury. They're thinking, gosh, this is such a horrendous, horrific crime, a heinous crime, and we know that the worst of the worst is reserved for the death penalty. So to that extent, I think this is very effective.
It's just cold-blooded murder is what it is. I mean, it's just awful. Matthew, I'll give you a chance to comment as well.
Well, Carissa, it had a sort of suspenseful component to it. You're walking along with the police officers as they enter the garage.
Yeah, it was a reveal.
Right, and you kind of just anticipate, and then obviously the jury wasn't looking at a blurred out vision of a body there. And it just really hits home. Hey, this isn't, we're not removed from this. We're seeing it just as it unfolded while the police investigated it. And I think it really is a compelling piece of evidence for the jurors. And we all like to watch. We're used to looking at something on a screen, and it just becomes so compelling in that regard for jurors to see that.
I couldn't agree with you more. It really does bring it to life. There was a reveal there. You see him walking, going into the parking garage. You don't know what you're going to see, but you can anticipate what you think you're going to see. And then, like you said, the jurors saw the body, and it was not blurred out. So it's very powerful. We must take a quick break. Stick with us. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. So that is a friend of Brenda Delgado, and she is here giving us evidence of the obsession of Brenda Delgado, really laying a foundation. This witness's name is Jennifer. So, Jennifer, I'm going to let you comment on this. How do you think the jury is taking this, and what is the point of her testimony?
Well, I think the point here is that this is not the co-defendant, Kristopher Cortez, who obviously is going to have some credibility issues. So now we've got an independent person here corroborating what this other co-defendant is saying. So it really helps support that argument that, in fact, Brenda was obsessed and that she made this plan to commit this murder.
Exactly. She's an independent witness, and she is not someone who has potential motive to lie because some plea deal was struck. Anything to add, Matthew?
Yeah, I think it's important. Not only is she an independent witness, I mean, she's a friend of Brenda Delgado. And she's in here saying
she's testifying against Brenda.
Right. She's testifying against her. She's telling the jury how Brenda obsessed over Ricky, and it really lays the foundation for why Brenda would go out and hire someone to kill Kendra.
So now let's listen to another friend of Brenda Delgado and what this person has to say in the sentencing phase in this death penalty case. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz. That is some interesting testimony from a friend of Brenda Delgado. Remember, she is the girlfriend that was obsessed with Ricardo and is the reason and motive behind hiring a hitman to kill the victim. Really sad facts. With me, Jennifer and Matthew. Let's talk about this for a second. What do you gather as the strategy behind this witness, who is the friend of Brenda Delgado, now testifying against Brenda Delgado about her obsession? Jennifer?
Well, here again, we've got another friend of Brenda's. So the fact that her friends are willing to turn against her and support this narrative that she was obsessed with her ex-boyfriend really goes to this argument that's being put forth by the prosecution. And now we've got at least two people who are supporting this. It also supports the co-defendant, Kristopher Cortez, who is the getaway driver, who maybe has some credibility issues, whereas this friend who's testifying maybe doesn't have those same issues.
All right, and Matthew, anything to add, or just you reiterate everything Jennifer just said?
No, I would agree with Jennifer, and it also gives context. Again, reminds the jury that Kristopher Love. This is why he did what he did. He got paid from Brenda Delgado because Brenda Delgado wanted Kendra out of the way. It just kind of it reemphasizes why that jury's here and why Kristopher Love killed Kendra.
One thing to also point out, we just saw some footage of the courtroom, and the jury does get to see the victim's face up, it looks like, throughout this trial and sentencing phase, which is an emotional plea on the heartstrings and really does bring it to life beyond the body cam that we just saw. Let's go to some testimony in the courtroom of Ricardo, the victim's boyfriend, and see how he adds to the sentencing phase of this death penalty case. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz, and that is testimony from Ricardo, the victim's boyfriend. You're listening to the Love trial and the case, gavel to gavel. He was found guilty of capital murder, and now this is the death penalty sentencing phase. We're hearing testimony, aggravating and mitigating, on whether or not he should be found to have the death penalty imposed on him as an appropriate sentence for this murder. I want to sign off my guests, Jennifer and Matthew. Thank you so much for joining us. Your insight was very much welcome. We're going to continue with this trial tomorrow, live in the courtroom. And this is a mini trial, basically, of the death penalty sentencing phase. I'm Carissa Kranz. Stick with us. Have a good night. Aaron will be joining us next on his show.